Ava Williams was always the kind of student who flew under the radar, quiet, observant, a bit too smart for her own good, and fiercely independent. She didn't need the spotlight. She preferred the back row in class, the kind of girl who turned in her assignments early, read 3 levels above her grade, and didn't think twice before raising her hand to correct the teacher's grammar. She wasn't rude, just precise. But for some, especially those used to being in control, that confidence could come off as something else. Attitude. At Roosevelt High, authority ran tight. Principal Reeves ran the school like a ship. Strict dress codes, zero-tolerance policies, and very little room for nuance. If something seemed out of line, punishment came fast and without much conversation. It all started one Tuesday morning when Ava wore a sweatshirt with a message printed across the back. In bold white letters, "Silence is complicity." It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was something her father, Detective Marcus Williams, had said to her. When she asked why he joined the force in the first place, she was proud of that phrase. It meant something. But that day, during 3rd period, she was called to the office, sitting across from Principal Reeves and Vice Principal Carter. She was told that her sweatshirt was provocative and that several staff members had reported it as potentially disruptive. Ava blinked. Disruptive to who? She asked, calmly. Reeves folded his hands. That's not your concern. We need you to change or be sent home. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply asked for the school handbook. There was no mention of political messages being banned on clothing. She said as much. That's when things escalated. They called her defiant, disrespectful, insubordinate. She was suspended on the spot. No warning. No call to her parents. Just a slip handed to her and instructions to leave the campus immediately. She sat on the curb outside the school for over an hour, trying to reach her dad. He was at court all morning, testifying in a domestic violence case. By the time he saw her missed calls and texts, he was already on his way back. When he arrived, his badge still on his belt and his body cam still clipped to his chest, he asked her calmly what happened. Ava told him everything. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just nodded. And then, in full uniform, he walked into the front office. The tone shifted immediately. The receptionist stood up straighter. The staff exchanged nervous glances. Reeves, confident as ever, came to greet him. Detective Williams, didn't expect to see you today. No, Marcus said. But you were expecting my daughter to leave without question, weren't you? A heavy silence. He pulled out the handbook. He asked where in it her sweatshirt violated policy. They couldn't answer. He asked for the written documentation of the disruption she allegedly caused. They had none. He asked if there had been a hearing, a warning, or any due process at all. They said it wasn't required. Then Marcus pressed the body cam on his chest and let it beep to life. I just want a record of this conversation, he said, in case this needs to go to the school board or court. Suddenly, the tone changed again. Reeves started backpedaling. Perhaps we were hasty. Maybe a warning would have sufficed. Marcus smiled. No need to change the story. I just want the truth. A week later, the suspension was quietly removed from Ava's record. But it didn't end there. Her father filed a formal complaint. He spoke at the school board meeting. Parents started asking questions. Students began wearing similar messages on their shirts. And Ava, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't post on social media. She didn't protest. She just went back to class. But now, the teachers looked at her a little differently, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who had the strength to ask, why? When others stayed silent. And in the quiet of her father's car on the ride home that day, she asked him, did I overdo it? He shook his head and smiled. You didn't speak up to get justice. You spoke up because it was right. The justice just happened to show up afterward. The next morning, Amina sat in the living room, still in her pajamas, barely touching her cereal. The silence was thick. Her father, Lieutenant Marcus Fields, paced the floor slowly in full uniform, his badge glinting in the morning sun. He had taken the day off, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He looked at his daughter and saw not a girl who had misbehaved, but a young woman who had been silenced. Amina, he said softly. Kneeling beside her, Tell me exactly what happened. And she did. She spoke of the group discussion in class about authority and community safety. She had raised her hand and offered a perspective as the daughter of a black police officer. She spoke about her father, how he treated people fairly. She questioned the notion that all authority figures were corrupt. Her tone was firm, her voice calm, but her teacher hadn't appreciated the dissent. The conversation shifted. The next day, Amina was accused of being disruptive and undermining authority. She was suspended for 3 days. Her voice had challenged the narrative, and that was her crime. Lieutenant Fields didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded. Then he stood up, put on his hat, and said, "Let's go." By 10 a.m., they were standing in front of Principal Watkins's office. The secretary looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Marcus said, his voice even. "But he'll want to make time." He didn't flash the badge, not yet. He didn't need to. When they stepped into the office, the principal greeted them with a forced smile. "Lieutenant Fields, how can I help you?" Marcus remained standing. "You suspended my daughter. I'm here to understand why." Principal Watkins gestured to the chair. "Please sit, I'll stand." Marcus said. The principal cleared his throat. "We had a situation in class. Amina disrupted a sensitive discussion. She refused to cooperate. It was in the best interest of the learning environment." "Interesting," Marcus replied, "because what I heard was that she shared her opinion, calmly, clearly, respectfully. And because it didn't fit your expectation, you called it disruption." She raised her voice. She spoke firmly. "There's a difference." Principal Watkins fidgeted with his pen. "We have policies, sir. Rules about respect." Marcus reached slowly into his breast pocket and placed his badge on the desk. "I know rules," he said quietly. "I live by them, and I also know bias when I see it." The room went still. "Let me ask you this," Marcus continued. "If she wasn't my daughter, if she was just a student whose father didn't wear this badge, would you have expected a challenge? Or would you have labeled her disruptive without hesitation?" The principal didn't respond. "Let me be clear," Marcus said. "My daughter will return to school today. Her record will be cleared, and she will be given an apology." "You're asking a lot," Watkins muttered. "No," Marcus replied. "I'm asking for accountability, and if that's too much for this institution, I'll be filing a report with the district." For a long moment, the principal said nothing. Then he nodded once. "She can return tomorrow." "Today," Marcus said. And with that, he picked up the badge, nodded to his daughter, and walked out. Amina followed, shoulders a little straighter, head held higher. When Amina walked back into school that afternoon, the hallways felt different. Not louder or busier, just watchful. Some kids whispered. Some avoided her gaze, but others, especially the quiet ones, the ones who usually kept to themselves, nodded at her. A small gesture, a silent alliance. They saw what had happened, and they understood something had shifted. By the time she entered her classroom, Miss Talbot, the teacher who had written her up, stood at the board preparing a new lesson. The moment Amina stepped inside, the room went quiet. Miss Talbot froze for just a second, then turned. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she said, "Welcome back, Amina." No apology, just that. But it didn't matter, because Amina's presence was a protest in itself. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to shrink, to feel ashamed, to carry the label they had tried to stick on her. But she didn't. She pulled out her notebook, sat down, and got to work. She listened. She took notes. And when the moment came to discuss the reading material, she raised her hand. For a moment, Miss Talbot hesitated, but then she nodded. Amina spoke clearly, not with defiance, but with clarity. She quoted from the text. She linked ideas to current events. She made the classroom what it should have always been, a space for dialogue. After class, a boy she barely knew, Miguel, who sat in the back and rarely spoke, walked up to her. "Hey," he said. "What you said last week, that stuff about fairness, that was brave." Amina nodded. "Thanks," he added. "They tried the same thing on my cousin at his school. Suspended him for talking about his neighborhood. Said it was too political. He didn't come back." Amina looked him in the eye. "He should have." Miguel gave a half smile. "Yeah, maybe now he will." Word began to spread, not just in school, but beyond. A parent from the PTA, who heard about the suspension, brought it up at the next meeting. Another parent, a civil rights attorney, asked to meet with Marcus privately. A blog picked up the story, then a local newspaper, not because it was rare, but because it was familiar. Too many voices had been silenced in quiet corners, behind polished doors. Under the pretense of order, Amina's case became a mirror for others. And slowly, the school had no choice but to change. As weeks passed, Amina noticed something shift, not just around her, but within her. Before the suspension, she saw school as a routine, a set of tasks, something to get through. Now she saw it as a stage, a place where stories were shaped, where narratives could be challenged, and where silence could be broken, not out of rage, but with intention. Her story began circulating on social media, a clip of her speaking at a student assembly, nervous at first, but firm in voice, was shared and reshared. She didn't speak with slogans. She didn't perform. She just told the truth. "I wasn't suspended because I broke a rule," she said. "I was suspended because I made someone uncomfortable. By existing in my full voice, that's not discipline. That's erasure." The audience fell quiet. Then it erupted. That moment did something more than raise awareness. It sparked connection. Students from other schools reached out. Some had been suspended for minor dress code violations that targeted specific cultures. Others had been punished for organizing peaceful protests. They began writing to her, DMing her, tagging her. Some simply wrote, "Thank you. I thought I was alone." And Amina? She didn't back away from the attention. She used it, with her father's help. She started a small local group, Speak Bold, a space where students could share their stories, organize support, and learn how to assert their rights respectfully but firmly. They met in the back of a local library on weekends. No hierarchy, no leaders, just voices, young, powerful voices learning to stand together. Amina never intended to become an advocate, but the path chose her the moment she refused to sit quietly and accept injustice. She understood now that courage wasn't about confrontation, it was about clarity. The courage to name what others refused to see. By the time she applied for college, her personal essay wasn't about test scores or clubs. It was about being misunderstood, silenced, then seen. It was about how a moment of humiliation sparked a mission far greater than herself. She was accepted with full scholarship, but she didn't leave her community behind. She returned often, mentoring students still struggling with the same walls she once faced. And the school, it changed to not perfectly, not immediately, but policies were reviewed. Staff underwent new training. A student board was created to give voice to the marginalized. It was the beginning of something honest, something overdue. And in the center of that shift was a girl who refused to let others define her worth, a girl who stood up, not to be praised but to be heard. College wasn't a fresh start for Amina. It was a continuation, an expansion of the fire that had already been lit inside her. From the moment she arrived on campus, she saw the signs, not the glossy brochures or diversity pledges, but the quiet signs. A professor's dismissive tone towards certain students, the way student clubs were funded, who had access to resources and who didn't, the same patterns of power, masked with politeness, still lingered in this new place. But now, Amina wasn't alone, and she wasn't unprepared. She joined a coalition for educational equity within her first semester, not to protest, but to organize, to build. She didn't want headlines. She wanted change. And change, she had learned, wasn't made in shouting matches. It was shaped in quiet meetings, relentless documentation, long nights researching policy, and moments of painful vulnerability. She shared her story in classrooms, at student conferences, and on panels, always with one goal, to humanize the abstract. One night, at a student-led town hall, she stood before hundreds of her peers and faculty and said, "Educational equity isn't a concept. It's a question we must ask every day. Who gets to belong? Who gets to be brilliant in peace? And who gets punished for simply showing up as themselves?" The room sat in still silence. No clapping, no noise, just reflection. That silence, she had learned, was powerful. During her junior year, she interned with a non-profit that focused on civil rights and education. What started as data entry turned into field research, then into speech writing for policy advocates. Her name slowly became recognized not as a symbol, but as a worker, someone who knew the pain and the paperwork. And then, senior year came. Her thesis wasn't traditional. It wasn't a paper, but a project. She created a documentary featuring stories from students suspended or expelled for vague or discriminatory reasons across the country. She called it Documented Silence. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, raw, and it made waves. Professors assigned it in their syllabi. One school district used it in their internal training. After graduation, Amina didn't head to a corporate job or law school immediately. She took a different path. She returned home, not to rest, but to invest. She expanded Speak Bold into a citywide initiative, working with school boards, organizing student-led workshops, and creating a youth advocacy curriculum taught in after-school programs. She wasn't just fixing her past. She was building a future for those still stuck in it. And while she was recognized, nominated for awards, invited to galas, profiled in local papers, she always redirected the attention back to the students. They are not statistics, she told a reporter once. They are change waiting to happen if we listen. Years passed. Amina eventually did attend law school, not for prestige, but because she wanted sharper tools. Her goal wasn't just to change schools. She wanted to change laws, and she did. By her early 30s, she had helped draft state-level legislation banning vague disciplinary policies disproportionately used against students of color. She had spoken before Congress. She had helped file amicus briefs in major education justice cases. But more than all of that, she had done something quieter and deeper. She had planted courage in hundreds, maybe thousands of students who watched her stand up when it mattered most. And for every headline, every panel, every law passed, she never forgot where it started. A false suspension, a father's badge, and the choice to turn pain into purpose. Years after Amina had graduated law school, she stood once again where it all began, not in her high school, but in the same city. The walls of the local community center were decorated with student artwork, and one canvas caught her eye. It was a painting, bold strokes of blue and gold. A girl standing defiantly in front of a towering building with the words "We belong" here painted above her head. The girl's stance reminded Amina of herself. The organizer of the exhibit approached her and said, "That student watched your documentary in 8th grade. Said it changed everything." Amina blinked. She had come to speak on a panel, but what she saw in that moment said more than any microphone ever could. Her work was echoing in spaces she'd never even walked into. By then, Documented Silence had become more than a student film. It had been archived in national databases, shown at education symposiums, adapted into teaching materials for schools across 4 states. Several districts that had once suspended students at 5 times the rate for minor infractions had revised their codes. Restorative justice programs replaced blanket punishments, and when new laws passed in 3 states, requiring schools to include student voices in disciplinary reviews. Her name was on the advocacy reports that made it happen. But beyond policy, her greatest legacy was cultural. Young people were speaking up, not with anger alone, but with clarity. With stories. With strategy. She received letters, not just from students, but from teachers. One wrote, "I used to think I was being strict. After hearing your story, I realized I was being silent." Another came from a principal in rural Iowa. "I rewrote our student conduct handbook because your speech made me realize I was protecting the system, not the children." Amina read every word. She didn't save the praise. She archived the proof, because every changed mind, every shifted heart was evidence that pain, when processed and shared with purpose, could lead to healing, far beyond its origin. Still, her journey wasn't without struggle. National recognition brought national criticism. She was labeled divisive by some, naive by others, but she never responded to insults with fire. She responded with facts, with faces, with names and numbers and truths too persistent to be ignored. And in moments when the weight of the work grew, Heavy, she returned to her roots. She kept a photo on her desk, her father, in his badge, standing next to her teenage self, the day she was reinstated to school. That image reminded her of what justice looked like when it showed up in time, and what it felt like when it didn't. So she kept fighting. By her 40s, she had helped create the National Student Rights Network, a coalition spanning 23 states, giving students legal literacy training and emergency support for unfair disciplinary actions. But she didn't run it from a distance. She still showed up. Still listened. Still believed that one student seen fully could start a revolution. Amina never set out to become a mentor. But when you walk a path others are still afraid to start, your footsteps become a guide without you even realizing it. One summer, she received an email from a 16-year-old named Jordan, a student from Mississippi who had faced an eerily similar suspension, vague accusations, no documentation, and zero opportunity to speak before being removed from school. Jordan had come across Amina's story late one night, watching clips of her congressional testimony online. "It felt like you were speaking for me," she wrote. "But now I want to speak for myself. I just don't know how." Amina read the message 3 times. That week, she called Jordan, not as an expert, as someone who remembered what it was like to feel small in front of systems built to erase your voice. And so began Amina's next chapter, not as the face of change, but as the fierce builder of others. She started a quiet initiative called Echo Scholars, a mentorship circle for students across the country who had faced school injustice. No flashy branding, no PR campaign, just real stories, weekly check-ins, strategy sessions, and a kind of belief that says, you already matter. Now let's make them listen. Jordan became the first Echo Scholar to present policy suggestions before her school board. Nervous but prepared, she stood with Amina in the back of the room, silently mouthing every word with her. 2 years later, Jordan was accepted into Howard University, with a full scholarship, declaring a double major in education reform and pre-law. By the 5th year, Echo Scholars had grown into a full-blown network, with chapters at over 100 high schools nationwide. Each local leader was a student who had once been silenced, now training others in advocacy, documentation, and policy engagement. But Amina's mentorship wasn't just professional. She helped them navigate trauma, taught them to rest without guilt, showed them how to keep their humanity intact in a world that often demanded they choose between justice and joy. One night, she hosted a retreat in the woods outside Asheville, where a dozen students sat around a bonfire. She asked them, what would justice look like if it didn't have to come with pain first? Silence. Then one student whispered, a classroom where we're protected before we're punished. Another said, a world where I don't have to be perfect to be believed. Amina smiled. Then let's build that. And they did, together. Their projects ranged from podcast series to curriculum audits to digital documentaries. But more than that, they built a culture of courage that began changing not just what schools allowed, but what they celebrated. Principals started calling Amina, not to defend suspensions but to prevent them, asking her how to restructure systems before harm was done, asking her how to listen first. Even lawmakers began to shift. When a bill proposing a National Student Protections Act reached Congress, it bore the fingerprints of Echo Scholars everywhere, from annotations to footnotes to language that came straight from student stories. Amina stood at the back of the hearing chamber, not at the microphone this time, but holding a folder full of letters from the students she mentored. She didn't speak that day, but she didn't have to. Her echo had become their voice. Amina never craved the spotlight, it had simply followed the impact. In her later years, she began retreating into a quieter rhythm. She no longer traveled weekly or testified before every panel. She didn't have to. The torch she once carried was now held by thousands of students, teachers, even former administrators who had changed because of her work. She bought a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Virginia, surrounded by pine trees and peace. The front porch overlooked acres of rolling grass and distant mountains. It was there, in the quiet, that Amina finally had space to hear her own thoughts uninterrupted. Mornings were slow. She'd rise before the sun, light a candle, and sip mint tea while writing in the journal she'd kept since her high school days. Her entries were no longer filled with fire and urgency. They were full of gratitude, clarity, and stillness. "Today, I did nothing extraordinary," she wrote once, "and I finally understand that peace is its own revolution." Still, the world didn't forget her. Every so often, she'd receive letters, hundreds of them, from people whose lives her story had touched, many she'd never met, parents who had found courage to stand up for their kids, teachers who had rewritten their disciplinary policies, even a former superintendent who now ran a restorative justice program and cited her as his turning point. But perhaps the most meaningful letter came on her 60th birthday. It was hand-delivered by Jordan, the first ECHO scholar. The letter wasn't addressed to Ms. Amina or founder. It simply said, "Dear Mom." Yes, in time, Amina had adopted Jordan first in spirit, then legally. When Jordan's own family situation crumbled in college, what began as mentorship had quietly grown into family. And not just with Jordan. Her home became a sanctuary for several young people who had no other place to go. They called it the Porch House. At the Porch House, there were no speeches, no protests, just love, safety, warm food, and honest conversations. It was there Amina taught her most powerful lessons: how to rest without guilt, how to hold space without needing to fix everything, how to love people deeply even when systems failed them. One summer evening, as cicadas hummed in the trees, Jordan asked her, "Do you ever regret it? Not becoming a senator, or running a foundation, or doing what people expected?" Amina smiled. "I used to think the goal was to change the whole world. Now I know it's enough to change someone's world." That night, she sat outside long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Looking up at the stars, she whispered, a silent prayer, not for more victories, but for more healing, for herself, for every child who had ever been silenced, and for the world she now saw slowly transforming, not because of one loud voice but because of a million quiet ripples. And somewhere between the rustle of the trees and the rhythm of her breath, she knew she had not just made history, she had made legacy. In the following years, Amina's story became more than a headline or a classroom lesson. It became a mirror for countless others to find courage within themselves. Universities invited her not just to speak, but to teach. She declined most, preferring the quiet life she had built. But when she did say yes, it was never to lecture. Instead, she told stories, stories that didn't begin with policies, but with people, stories where justice wasn't a courtroom result, but a journey of dignity, of understanding, of hard-earned peace. Her philosophy was simple, yet radical: listen before you lead, heal before you act. Jordan, now a civil rights attorney, would often recount her mother's wisdom in courtrooms across the country. In moments of tension or when facing a system that still failed too many, she'd remember Amina's words: "You're not just fighting for a verdict, you're fighting for the soul of how we treat each other." More Porch House kids came and went. Some stayed for months, others for years. Each left with something they hadn't arrived with: a sense of being seen, a belief that their voice mattered, a legacy passed down not in blood, but in bravery. One fall, a documentary team begged Amina for a filmed interview. She finally agreed on one condition: no dramatization, just truth. They recorded her on the porch at golden hour, her face lined with time, her voice softer but no less certain. When they asked her what justice meant, she didn't mention laws or punishments. Instead, she said, "Justice is when a child doesn't have to carry the weight of being disbelieved. It's when your silence is no longer mistaken for guilt. It's when your truth is finally safe." The film aired quietly. No awards, no trending hashtags. But in homes across the country, people wept. Teachers reconsidered how they disciplined. Parents hugged their children a little tighter. And young girls with quiet fire in their eyes realized they, too, could speak up and survive what followed. In the end, Amina's final journal entry was found by Jordan years later, tucked into the back of a worn leather notebook. It read, "I did not win every battle. I was not always believed, but I never gave up on truth. And if even one child lives freer because I stood my ground, then I lived well." Beneath that, just 3 words, circled twice: love, legacy, liberation. And with that, her life became what She had always hoped her story would be not loud, not perfect, but real. A life rooted in courage. A life that reminded us all when justice seems too far away. Sometimes the most radical act is to keep telling the truth until someone listens. And they will. They always do. Eventually. It's a word that carried the weight of generations. For Jordan, eventually became her North Star. In every case she took on, in every young client who sat trembling across from her, she whispered it like a promise. They will hear you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, in time, her name began to carry weight in legal circles, not for aggression or theatrics but for resolve, for compassion, for the fact that she never backed down when it came to justice. Just like her mother, she started a foundation in Amina's honor, the Porchlight Project, named after the light her mother always left on for those who needed a place to land. Its mission, to protect students wrongfully disciplined or silenced, to train teachers in implicit bias, and to support families navigating school injustice. But its heart wasn't in policy, it was in presence. Volunteers were trained not just to act, but to listen, to see, to believe. And slowly, schools changed, not by force, but by influence, by stories, by the thousands of voices once ignored, now amplified. Years later, at the dedication of a small public library named after Amina Collins, a young girl asked Jordan, "Was your mom a superhero?" Jordan smiled and knelt down. "No, sweetheart," she said. "She was something braver. She was a mother who told the truth and kept going, even when the world didn't want her to." The girl thought for a moment. "I think that is a superhero." Jordan looked toward the sky, and for a brief moment, the breeze felt like a hand on her shoulder, somewhere. She imagined her mother smiling,